Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Teachers Talk Money podcast, where I help teachers master their money in order to give back to themselves. This episode is coming to you a little bit later than expected due to some tech difficulties with recording the show, so that part is unfortunate, but I'm still here, and we're still going to do our 20th episode season finale spectacular. I am so grateful to have made it to 20 episodes, to have created a first season that I believe is so full of powerful, inspiring, and actionable advice for educators to get started getting control of their money. And I have to say I'm really blown away with all of the positive feedback and all of the awesome questions that we've gotten from listeners and their money wins and celebrations, as well as just the fact that I'm really impressed with the stats for this season too, which we'll get into in a little bit. But first, we are going to do some life updates for me. Normally I would do this in the beginning of the episode with Christy, and I'm missing her a lot today as this is the first full-length episode that I've done on my own, just me talking to the mic, no interviewee, and no co-host on the other side to bounce things off of. But I still wanted to keep you guys updated on my life, and my big update is just that I'm really, really grateful that we're back in the building this school year. It's just felt so nice. It's really refreshed my view of why I'm doing this work. And I feel like I lost sight of that last year in particular when we were in virtual learning. And there weren't as many of the super low lows in terms of just days where the workload is crazy. And then you have a behavioral issue or you have a tough parent phone call or meeting or sort of the things of that nature, the kind of things that just pile on and on. With virtual learning, it was definitely a learning curve at first. We had to adjust so much and it felt really isolating, but we had decreased the schedule and workload for students so much in my district that my work-life balance was really awesome, actually, once we finally got into the school year, because I was just planning fewer lessons than I was used to planning, grading fewer things than I was used to having to grade, because we only saw students twice a week for class. So I didn't have the low lows, but I certainly did not experience any of the high highs in terms of I just felt like when we were virtual, I did not build relationships with students the way that I'm used to. There was certainly a handful of students who I felt like I really did get to know on a deeper level, but for the most part, I still couldn't tell you what they look like, and that was really a small amount of students compared to how many students I feel like I'm able to build a relationship with during a normal in-person school year. Now, I'm not saying this year is perfect because it certainly hasn't been. The shortage has been hitting my building hard this year, and life has just still been hard in the pandemic. In addition to sort of the increased coverage that I have to do, we are also doing a lot of quote makeup testing in my building that we're required to do, and it's really frustrating at times. And of course there's all the typical frustrations around teacher autonomy and workload, frankly. So it's certainly not perfect, but I do feel like this year I have my feet on the ground a little bit more in terms of knowing that this is the career that I want to do until I retire, and reminding myself why that is. And that's really just the relationships that I'm able to have with the kids. My other update is that me and Christy just had our birthdays. I think we've mentioned on the show previously that we share a birthday. So I just turned 25, and I believe Christy is now 44, if I'm remembering correctly. It's a little bit sad because we had originally planned to do a birthday episode special, but of course with Christy's life being completely turned upside down after David's diagnosis, I'm only going to be able to share my own perspective on what this year holds for me. So I'll try to do that as quickly as possible. I have to say that this birthday has been uncharacteristically sentimental to me. I don't tend to be sentimental about birthdays. I actually tend to kind of do the opposite, but this one definitely I've just been in my feels about it. Maybe it's the quarter century thing or the mid-20s thing, but I'm really reflecting a lot and really sort of thinking about what I want this year to hold for me. From a young age, my life has been characterized by this feeling of racing to get ahead and accomplish all of the things I want or think I want, and do so at a pace that not a lot of people around me do. So this is due to a lot of factors. I think it's part internalized capitalism, part generalized anxiety, and part because of the fact that I'm often one of the youngest people in the room. I've always been younger than most people in my grade, younger than most people in my walk of life, and just have always spent a lot of time around adults and people who are older than me. And this sort of feeling of trying to get ahead, quote unquote, is a great motivation in a lot of ways to always go for what I want, with what seems to be less hesitation than a lot of people I know. It's a factor in why I started Teachers Talk Money and have continued to expand it. It's a factor in why I put in the effort to get my money life under control earlier than people tend to. But it's not all good. In fact, I would say I wouldn't even say it's mostly good. Like with most things in life, it's a two-sided coin. It means that I feel behind a lot, even when I know that's not really relevant, because the idea of feeling behind assumes that there's such a thing as like a correct timeline for life. And intellectually, I know that that's false and beside the point. But it's still very tough to unlearn this feeling. So that's what I'm focusing on this year, unlearning the feeling of trying to be ahead, slowing down, and prioritizing the things that really matter and only putting the important things on my plate. So that's the direction I'm headed in my life, with every single aspect of my life, including teaching, including working on Teachers Talk Money as a YouTube channel and podcast. I think I'm going to do a lot of reconsidering and re-envisioning what I want this brand to look like, especially now that with the podcast, I'm going to be riding solo without my ride or die Christy by my side. So in this episode, I'm going to share a couple pieces of feedback, questions, and celebrations that we've received from listeners throughout the season, as well as some updates about the show. So first, I want to take a look at the show by the numbers. I know that this is something that I'm always curious about as an avid podcast listener myself, and to me, it's a really big celebration. So taking a look at all of our stats, including the stats from every podcast service that we're on and YouTube views of the show, we have had on average over 400 listeners for every single episode. This makes my heart feel so full knowing that so many teachers are finding value in the show and hopefully getting really practical advice and encouragement. I'm really blown away by the number of 400 listeners for every single episode, because that reach to me is huge. That's more than the views that I get on a typical YouTube video by far. And I also just know that the quality of these episodes is so strong and that teachers can learn so much from listening to it. So I'm just really glad it's reached so many listeners. And that is really thanks to all of you for sharing the show, adding reviews, sharing it on social media, word of mouth, telling your teacher friends about it. I would not have been able to do it without you. Christy and I would not have been able to do it without you. And now, of course, you have a full season of episodes to refer people to, and we really covered a lot of the basics of teacher money management. And I'm just really glad to have created this resource for teachers to get this free advice. So now I just want to go into some listener questions, feedback, and money wins. Christy and I both received a lot of DMs, of course, throughout the season. I get a lot of questions on my YouTube channel or on Instagram posts and things like that as well. But for the purposes of today's episode, we're just going to do a little bit of a mailbag from the emails we have received this year, just to keep it short and sweet. And we're going to start off with an email from an anonymous listener. They say, "Hi, I'm a fellow teacher who loves to talk money, teaching in 6th grade in Oregon. I really appreciate your podcast and so glad I found it. Your latest episode with Dave was so important, and I appreciate all the information and clarity you brought to a complicated issue like teacher student loans. I just finished my 5th year teaching in a qualifying school, and all my paperwork is in for TLF. Hoping that program will wipe out the last of my student loans any day now. One program I wish more teachers knew about, and I only discovered and used these last couple years, is teacher loan forgiveness forbearance. This is for teachers who are already in teaching placements that qualify for TLF, who are in the 5-year journey to TLF. If teacher loan forgiveness will take care of all of a teacher's remaining loans, in other words, they owe less than $5,000 or $17,500, depending on their teacher placement, they can receive teacher loan forgiveness forbearance, which means no payments at all while teaching the 5 years towards TLF. It needs to be renewed each year, but it is a short form. I'm on a mission to get the word out about this option because I wish I had discovered it 3 years sooner myself. Thanks for your podcast and keep up the good work opening up the money conversation with teachers. Thank you so much for this email because this is amazing advice. If you're listening to this and you have no idea what I'm talking about when I talk about teacher loan forgiveness or what this listener is talking about, then make sure to go back and listen to episode 10 of the podcast where Christy interviewed David, formerly known as the budget teacher, about all things teacher loan forgiveness and public service loan forgiveness, which are two different programs. What this teacher is talking about is she's saying that there's something called teacher loan forgiveness forbearance, and if you're in the process for TLF, you can use forbearance every single year if the TLF is going to wipe out all of your remaining loans. Which means not only do you get all of that money forgiven, but you don't have to make payments while you're working towards TLF. So that is huge to me. I have not done any vetting on this information myself, so make sure to read the fine print and make sure you understand it. Or talk to a certified student loan professional to make sure that you're doing all the steps you need to get this. But that is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. Thank you so much for sharing. Our next piece of advice comes from a listener named Sarah, and she said, "Hi Rachel and Christy, I had to share this money with you. Preface, I've been learning about investing this year. I was really intimidated by it before and finally faced the dragon and dove into learning about it. I read a handful of books, the most helpful one being The Simple Path to Wealth by J.L. Collins that you also recommended, Christy. Things really clicked with me when I read it. I've been able to fine-tune my husband's and my financial life. Now I feel so optimistic about our future and long-term goals. Anyway, I was in a coffee shop the other day getting work done, and I was near a young woman who was on a Zoom. I could tell right away by overhearing her side of the conversation that she was a financial advisor being recruited by another company. I was so proud of myself because I knew everything she was talking about. It just proves that once you get a hold of the lingo or jargon, investing is easy to understand and is super empowering when you do. Thanks for helping teachers get set up for financial success. It's a beautiful gift you give to the world." I love this story from Sarah for a couple of reasons. The first thing that stands out to me is she mentions facing the dragon and finally learning about investing. And this is a metaphor that Christy came up with when we started our investing series over the summer. For reference, our investing series is episode 10, 12, and 13 of the show. So if you are ready to start facing that dragon, make sure you go back and check out those episodes. And I also love that she read a handful of books only, and she gives us the most helpful one, which to her was The Simple Path to Wealth by J.L. Collins. And I believe that she's correct that Christy has recommended it on the podcast before. I have not personally read this book, but it seems like an awesome recommendation by some trustworthy people, if you ask me. Also, I love that Sarah's getting her husband on board too, and that the details have been fine-tuned among both of them, and they are acting as a team for those long-term goals. I love, love, love hearing perspectives of people working together with their partners, managing money with kids, and all of the things that I just don't have the same kind of insight on. So if you have any money wins or questions or feedback to share about those topics, don't hold back, because especially now that I'm hosting this solo, my perspective has become even more limited. The second thing I love about this email is that I love the story about Sarah sitting in the coffee shop overhearing another person on a Zoom talking about investing and understanding everything they're talking about. This is a beautiful feeling. I experience this personally whenever I'm listening to like a financial podcast that I love. And if they have like callers calling in for advice, I love to try and predict what the expert or host of the podcast is going to say. So I absolutely relate to this feeling when I am able to do that. It was a huge, huge deal in the beginning of my journey of sort of self-educating myself on personal finance. And yeah, it just feels amazing to finally understand what the heck is going on when it comes to investing, which is a topic that seems so difficult and complex, but just becomes more clear and simpler the more you look at it. Our next question comes from an anonymous listener who emailed us saying, Hello, I have a question for you, but first I want to say thanks. Based on your podcast, I set up my Roth IRA and made my husband do it too. I totally had that fear of even thinking about money in retirement, and you guys helped me snap out of it. So here's my question. I received an inheritance from my dad's estate of just over $100K. We would like to use that money for a down payment on a house within the next year. It sort of depends on my ability to get a new job in a lower cost of living area. So I don't have an exact time on when we will need it, but the hope is sometime in 6 to 12 months. Where is the best place to store that money, knowing that I can't really risk the loss and ride out the market? My savings account is such a low rate of return that it's losing money to inflation all the time it's just sitting there. Is there a good, low-risk, relatively short-term option that will avoid paying new taxes on it, or should I just let it sit in savings for now? Thank you so much. I really appreciate your help and the time you've already taken to read my email. This is a really awesome question. First, I want to just congratulate this listener on setting up their Roth IRA and once again, getting their husband on board and having him do it as well. I feel really honored that Christy and I had a hand in, as this listener puts, snapping her out of it and getting her to start thinking about money and retirement. Because that really is the biggest barrier, is just the getting started. It's the first step out the door. And then I think this question is really good as well. So the listener received an inheritance from their father's estate of just over $100,000. They want to use the money for a down payment within the next year, and they said sometime in 6 to 12 months, and they want to know where's the best place to store the money and whether or not they should invest it, because they said their savings rate is such a low rate of return that it's actually losing value to inflation, which is true. Most savings accounts do not keep up with inflation, so that's certainly something to consider. However, I would not recommend that this listener invests the money. You never want to invest money that you'll need to access within about 5 years. So those shorter term goals should all be savings accounts. Whereas longer term goals, typically retirement, maybe a down payment on a house if you're very flexible on your timeline and are willing to sort of wait it out and ride out any market fluctuations. In that case, you can kind of invest for those goals that are more than about 5 years out. That's not a hard and fast rule, of course, but it's a good rule of thumb. What I would suggest for this listener is that she puts the money in a high yield savings account, whatever savings account she can get that has the basic things she's looking for, as well as the highest interest rate she can find. Now, since the pandemic hit, no savings accounts have been that amazing, even the high yield savings accounts. So she's not going to find an amazing rate of return or even one that's guaranteed to outpace the year's inflation. However, she can make slightly more money than she'd be making in a traditional savings account. Maybe even a substantial amount more, considering she's going to be saving this huge lump sum of money. Again, no guarantees it's going to outpace inflation, but it'll get a little bit closer to that than a normal savings account would. And what I did for this listener is when I emailed her back, I sent her a NerdWallet article that sort of compares different high yield savings accounts. And that's what I would suggest anybody look at if you are wanting to open up an HYSA, high yield savings account. I'll put a link to the article I sent the listener in the show notes in case anybody else is looking to save for a goal that's within the next 5 years and they want to make a little bit more interest than they would get in a normal savings account. Our final piece of feedback for this episode comes from a listener named Tyler. And he says, "Hello, I found your podcast recently and have been catching up. I'm really enjoying it, and I look forward to recommending it to colleagues, as I'm trying to show that I'm someone willing to talk about money with them if they desire. Anyway, I was listening to episode 3 and felt compelled to email you to let you know that both of your experiences with tenure/job stability are not necessarily representative." Tyler goes on to share his story, but he did give me a TLDR, or a too long didn't read sentence that I'm just going to share instead of going through his whole sort of history with this. But basically, he received layoff notices in 6 of his first 11 years of teaching before he finally got tenure. This was due to a lot of reasons, sort of the aftermath of the Great Recession, state legislators scrapping tenure laws at some point, working in private schools for some time, etc. So it was sort of a variety of different factors each and every time. Anyway, he continues on to say, so I hope that in the future you at least allude to the fact that job stability can be a benefit of teaching, but is certainly not always the case that you get the, quote, benefit from the start. Again, I'm really enjoying the podcast, and I'm looking forward to getting fully caught up and continuing with you as your show continues to unfold. This is a really awesome email too. I really like, first off, that he talks about sharing the show with other educators, not just so that they can get the information, but to show that he's somebody that they can come to for money advice. That's a really big deal because a lot of teachers do just need that like one person, that one liaison in their building who they can ask about the specific things in their district, right? Because you can get a lot of really great general advice from resources like this podcast, but it doesn't beat having somebody in your building that knows the ins and outs of your retirement system, how your pension works, and all of the details of your contract. And I also really love that Tyler shares his experience to illustrate the point that you don't necessarily have the benefit of job security as a teacher. This is something that in Christy's life and in my life, we've had that experience, but that's true that it just isn't always a guarantee depending on a number of different factors. And once again, it's one of those areas where, you know, two podcast hosts, as much as we try to be as intergenerational as possible and look into the various issues that don't affect us, a big one of those for me and Christy being childcare costs and things like that because we don't have children. And of course, just the myriad of privileges that we get from being white women and white teachers. There's just going to be a lot of blind spots, and this was one of them, that we both sort of had this assumed sense of job security that is not the case for teachers everywhere. So I'm really glad that Tyler sort of added in this bit of feedback for everyone to hear so that it's not something we assume we have from the beginning. So in closing, I just want to say that I'm so grateful for every single listener this season, and I feel incredibly lucky to have been able to make this first season with Christy, who added so much to the show. After I post this finale episode, I'm going to take some time to really consider my goals and vision for season 2 of the show. I want to ensure that I'm adding the most value possible. So at the moment, I'm not going to commit to a start date for season 2, but stay tuned on my YouTube channel and Instagram to make sure that you know when to expect episode 1 of season 2. If you have any feedback or suggestions on what you think would be the most beneficial topics to cover, or teachers or money professionals you think I should interview, I welcome all of this as I plan to prepare during the off season. Especially if you have interview guest ideas, because as you know, I'm going to be doing a lot more interview episodes in season 2 in order to try and maintain the conversational tone of the show, and then just have a couple solo episodes sprinkled around about more general money topics. So, signing off for the last time. Thank you all for making the show so incredibly fulfilling and worthwhile. And I can't wait to see you in season 2. Bye, everybody.